Welcome to the Designing and Implementing a Symantec Data Loss Prevention Installation module of the Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15.7 Planning, Implementation, and Administration course. In this module, we will discuss the following topics: laying the groundwork for a Symantec DLP implementation, as well as design considerations for the Symantec DLP database and the Enforce server. Finally, we'll discuss preparing to install Symantec DLP. The planning phase of a Symantec DLP implementation project is crucial to ensuring both the immediate and long-term success of your organization's data loss prevention program. This module will provide an overview of significant points to consider throughout the planning process, such as the people in your organization you need to communicate with and whose support it is vital to secure from the beginning of the project, strategies for optimizing the performance of Symantec DLP products, and pertinent questions related to your organization's data, network architecture, and data loss prevention needs that should be asked during the implementation planning. Note that the intention is not to prescribe every detailed step that must be performed to successfully plan a Symantec DLP implementation. Organizations' data loss prevention needs and IT infrastructures vary widely, so it is not realistic to attempt to define a one-size-fits-all planning procedure. Rather, this module will attempt to highlight the important concepts and considerations that should be kept in the forefront of your planning efforts when you're implementing Symantec DLP in your organization. Laying the groundwork for a Symantec DLP implementation. Before you can begin to determine where and how a Symantec DLP will be installed in your network infrastructure, you must develop a good working understanding of where data, whether sensitive or not, exists in your organization and who manages and controls access to that data. You must also ensure that management is committed to protecting that data. Here are examples of the kinds of questions that a Symantec DLP implementation planning task force should be asking as they lay the groundwork for deploying Symantec DLP in their organization. How much data potentially needs to be protected across the organization? How much storage space is needed? What kinds of information need to be protected? For instance, personal information of employees and customers, or intellectual property, or financial records. Where does sensitive data exist in the organization's IT infrastructure? Endpoint hard drives, network shares, document repositories, databases? Is it transferred through email as text or attachments? Or is it viewed, uploaded to, or downloaded from websites and internet services? How many different file types are used in the organization to store sensitive data? And for multi-site and multinational organizations, how many sites or separate networks need to be protected? The first step to identifying where data exists in your organization is determining who owns the data and has an interest in protecting it. An effective approach to this task is to build a Symantec DLP implementation planning task force that is composed of key stakeholders across the organization, from an executive-level sponsor down to the staff that manages the organization's databases, network files, document repositories, mail servers, and MTAs, etc. A strong dedicated project manager is critical. When supported by an executive-level sponsor and an appropriately staffed engineering team and information protection team, the project manager can drive the cross-functional and cross-organizational involvement needed to identify the locations of all data assets that need to be protected, as well as obtain the approval and credentials needed to access those assets. This figure shown here shows a possible structure for a task force. After the implementation planning task force is in place, the project manager should work with the engineering team to determine the locations and number of data assets that need to be protected and the types of data that exist in each location. This information is critical to understanding where and how many Enforce servers and detection servers will need to be deployed, as well as the types of detection servers to deploy. Additionally, the project manager should obtain any access permissions or credentials needed to perform discovery scans and protect sensitive data in these locations. Design considerations for the Symantec DLP database and the Enforce server. In this topic, we'll briefly discuss sizing and scaling considerations, performance optimization strategies, and high availability best practices for implementing the Oracle database and the Enforce server software as part of Symantec DLP. There are several important questions that the Symantec DLP implementation planning task force needs to ask as they plan the deployment of the DLP Oracle database and the Enforce server software. For instance, does the organization already have a dedicated Oracle database administration team that can create, maintain, and back up the Symantec DLP database? Or will the DLP team need to perform these functions on their own? Where will the Oracle database be installed? Will it be on a physical machine that's on-premise, or on a virtual machine, or in a hosted environment in the cloud? If the Oracle database will be installed on-premise on a physical server or a virtual machine, will it be deployed on the same server as the Enforce server and the Detection server, what's known as a single-tier installation? Or will it be on the same hardware as the Enforce server, but different than the Detection server, known as a two-tier installation? Or will it be installed by itself on dedicated hardware, separate from Enforce and any Detection servers, what's known as a three-tier installation? In addition, the planning group should consider how many users will need logins to the Enforce administration console, and what roles will they be assigned. Some of the commonly used DLP roles include System Administrator, User Administrator, Policy Administrator, Policy Author, and Incident Responder. An important concern when planning for the Symantec DLP Oracle database is sizing, which refers to the required hardware resources for the database to function properly, such as the amount of storage space available. For both Oracle and the Enforce server, scaling, or the number of separate DLP database and Enforce server instances that will be needed, is also an important concern. Both sizing and scaling considerations are particularly important for the Oracle database, because the volume of DLP incidents that can be generated in a large organization may quickly overwhelm the database if capacity planning is inadequate. The Symantec Data Loss Prevention System Requirements and Compatibility Guide states that with any large DLP deployment, the Oracle database should have at least 1 terabyte of free storage space. However, the actual amount of disk space that is required for the Oracle database will depend on certain variables, such as the number of policies you plan to deploy, the length of time you intend to store incident records, and if you are planning on keeping attachments with incident records, the number and size of those attachments. Let's imagine a fictional organization called Example Corporation, which we'll use as a frame of reference for implementation planning considerations. This is a corporation of 10,000 plus employees with 3 sites and 3 countries. A graphical representation of Example Corporation and all of their networks and resources are shown in this figure. In this example, our fictional Example Corporation anticipates that in the long term they will need a total of about 100 policies across all departments. The organization will only want to keep attachments in the database that are smaller than 5 megabytes and that have a high severity level, and they plan on retaining incident records for 120 days. So in the case of this Example Corporation, a more reasonable size for the Symantec DLP Oracle database based on these criteria would be 4 terabytes. For scaling considerations, the complexity and size of an organization and the quality of their internet connectivity will play important roles in determining how many instances of the Symantec DLP Oracle database should be installed. Generally speaking, if an organization only has a single site, or if they have multiple sites that all have fast internet connections, a single Oracle database should suffice. However, a multi-site organization that has 1 or more sites with poor internet connection speeds, it is preferable to install a separate Oracle database at each of the sites with a slow connection. Additionally, multinational organizations may be required to install separate databases at some sites in order to comply with local data governance regulations. For our Example Corporation, they have 3 sites that are spread out over 3 countries. The bandwidth and connectivity between sites 1 and 2 are excellent, so it's reasonable to have a single database for these sites. However, the bandwidth and connectivity for Site 3 is currently very slow, so it would be a good choice to install a separate Oracle database just at Site 3. After determining the Symantec DLP Oracle database server arrangement, it is a simple matter to then determine how many Enforce servers you will need, 1 Enforce server per Oracle database. So in the case of our Example Corporation, they have 2 Oracle databases, 1 at their headquarters at Site 1 and 1 at their remote Site 3. So consequently, they will need to install 1 Enforce server at Site 1 and another at Site 3. Although most organizations will only have 1 instance of the DLP Oracle database and Enforce server in their production environment, larger organizations may want to implement architectural redundancy by adding in additional Enforce servers and Oracle databases at each of their sites. In addition, because Enforce is the keystone of the Symantec DLP implementation and stores configuration parameters, DLP policies, and highly sensitive incident data, disaster recovery should also be a critical consideration for the Enforce server, meaning regularly scheduled backups should be the foundation of any DR plan for both the Oracle database and the Enforce server. Preparing to install Symantec DLP. This topic briefly discusses the system requirements for DLP components and lists the software and information that must be gathered prior to installing Symantec DLP. As mentioned earlier, one of the first questions that needs to be answered is the type of installation or tier. In a single-tier installation, the Oracle database, Enforce server, and a detection server are all installed on the same computer. Typically, this installation tier is implemented for testing purposes only. In a two-tier installation, the Oracle database and the Enforce server are installed on the same computer, while detection servers are installed on one or more separate computers. Typically, this installation is used in situations where an organization does not have its own database administration team. In a three-tier installation, the Oracle database, the Enforce server, and separate detection servers are installed on separate computers. Symantec recommends the three-tier installation for organizations that do have a dedicated database administration team, because database maintenance jobs, such as backup and recovery of the database, can be handled by that team. The system requirements in this section are tailored to large organizations, which Symantec defines as organizations with more than 10,000 employees and more than 40 megabits per second of network traffic, which typically requires more robust policies for detection. Symantec recommends using the three-tier installation option for deploying Symantec DLP in large organizations, meaning Oracle will be on its own dedicated server. The minimum system requirements for the Oracle installation in a three-tier environment are outlined in this table. The minimum system requirements for the Enforce server and various detection servers are shown in this table, and keep in mind that as minimum requirements, your organization may require more resources than are indicated here. For organizations that are interested in transitioning some or all of their DLP infrastructure to the cloud, Symantec DLP also supports deploying the Enforce server, the Oracle database, and detection servers in a two- or three-tier installation on a hosted service provider network, such as Amazon Web Services. This diagram shows an example organization that has decided to implement a hybrid three-tier Symantec DLP environment. They have deployed their Enforce server, Oracle database, and endpoint and network monitor servers on-premise, but have deployed Network Prevent for email, Network Discover, and Network Prevent for web detection servers within Amazon Web Services. When planning for a hosted or hybrid installation, take special note of the requirements and restrictions for the deployment of detection servers in a hosted infrastructure, as well as operating system requirements, as shown here. Symantec DLP can also be deployed in a virtual environment, with the system requirements as shown in this table. For DLP installations that desire to use optical character recognition, or OCR, as part of their detection strategy, it is recommended because of the high processing requirements that the OCR server be installed on dedicated hardware, with system requirements as shown in this table. For endpoint agents that will be installed on endpoint laptops or workstations, the minimum system requirements are shown here in this table. In summary, the Symantec DLP planning and installation team will need to ask some important questions before the installation process begins. For instance, will the installation be a single, two, or three-tier installation, and how many separate Enforce servers and Oracle databases will be required to cover all remote sites? If endpoint monitoring is desired, then the endpoint agents must be installed on compatible workstations and laptops. It is recommended that the optical character recognition software, if used, should have its own dedicated server. Additionally, for cloud or hybrid environments, Symantec supports deploying Symantec DLP in a two-tier or three-tier installation on a hosted service provider network, such as Amazon Web Services. Thank you for joining us. This concludes the Designing and Implementing a Symantec Data Loss Prevention Installation module of the Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15.7 Planning, Implementation, and Administration course. In this demo video, we'll be showing how to install Enforce on a two-tier or three-tier system, meaning that the Oracle database has already been installed and configured on its own server separate from this Enforce server. The first step in the installation process is to install the Java runtime environment, and the appropriate installer for this is included in the Enforce install package. Once the JRE install process has completed, we can continue with the Enforce server installation. The Enforce server setup wizard will walk you through many of the required and optional configuration settings for the install process. These options will include the location of the install, the location of the JRE, as well as whether to enable the FIPS algorithm for cryptography. In this setup, we've already configured existing Windows users and will now enter them into the setup wizard. Next, we will enter the hostname and login information for the Oracle database. Optionally, we can configure an external storage area in order to store incident attachments to save room in the database. Once all the settings have been configured, the installation process will begin and may take up to 10 or 15 minutes. Once the install process is finished, we can confirm that DLP has been successfully installed by going to Windows, Services, and checking for the Symantec DLP services, including the Detection Server Controller, the Incident Persister Service, the Manager Service, and the Notifier Service. After Enforce is installed and running, we can go directly to the Enforce web interface by opening a web browser and going to the domain, in this case enforce.example.com/protectmanager/logon. From there, we can enter in the administrator login and password in order to enter the Enforce console. Once you have entered the Enforce administration console, the next important step will be to upload the appropriate license to enable all of the DLP features. From the console, go to System, Settings, General, and then hit the Configure button. In the License section, click the Browse button, and then upload the appropriate DLP license. Once the license has been uploaded, you will receive a notification on the configuration screen showing which of the individual products have been enabled in this DLP instance. DLP also provides a variety of solution packs included with the install. These solution packs can offer a wide variety of pre-created policies and other material based on various categories, such as financial, healthcare, insurance, manufacturing, or pharmaceutical. Once a detection server has been installed, either on the same machine or on a separate machine, we can add it to the Enforce server by selecting Add Server, Software Server, and then choosing the appropriate detection server type. Here, we will give the server a name and add in the connection information, including hostname and port. Here, we can also configure the specific configuration settings for the individual detection server types. In this example, we're configuring a network monitor server where we can select one or more protocols to enable for packet capture. In this instance, we will configure it to capture HTTP packets. Once the detection server has been added, from the Enforce System Servers and Detectors overview screen, we can view the startup and running status of each of the important services on the detection server.